It's entirely possible for us to claim to follow Jesus without ever being deeply formed by Christ. Our pace can be too fast to be in true union with God, and we don't know how to quiet our hearts and minds to be present. Our emotions can be unhealthy and compartmentalized. We can feel unable to love well or to live a better way, differently from the rest of the world, to live as people of the good news. The deeply formed life centers on 5 key values: contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation, interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence that will help us be deeply formed by Jesus to restore balance, focus, and meaning for our souls.
My family loves Pixar movies. The Toy Story movies, the Cars movies, the new ones, the old ones, they're all so good. They're funny and cute. And lately they also seem to be tackling really deep topics like complex family relationships, grief and loss, thwarted dreams. Maybe you've seen a joke recently about how Pixar movies were just like, well, if you won't go to therapy, we'll bring therapy to you. The movie that demonstrates this most clearly in my mind is Inside Out. Like, wow, Riley moves from Minnesota to California and loses hockey, decent pizza, and all of her friendships. Throughout the story, her parents are doing their best in what is a stressful situation for them as well. And they attempt to give her positive feedback on how well she's handling the move and how calm she is at every bump in the road. And their positive feedback actually makes it difficult for Riley to be honest with herself and her parents about how much she's struggling. Now, the audience is able to see inside the brains of the main characters, and they watch as their 5 primary emotions, joy, sadness, disgust, fear, and anger, interact with each other. And by the end of the story, we see that to lead fully human lives requires us to integrate everything inside of us, all of our emotions. If joy is the only emotion allowed to be in control, it actually does damage. In order to integrate our emotions, we must intentionally look below the surface, to prayerfully hold together the different parts of our lives. And the degree to which we integrate these different parts of our lives is the degree to which we will live like Jesus. We're in a series on the deeply formed life, a book by Rich Villodas, and the series that he preached at his church, New Life Fellowship in New York. We're learning together that the purpose of being a Christian is not to cross the chasm of our sin to join Jesus in heaven. The purpose of being a Christian is to see Christ formed in us. And Jesus wants to transform all of our lives, not just the surface, not just the outside. Jesus wants to transform our whole lives, especially our inner lives. Now, this transformation can be tricky to navigate, because most of us have already received messages about our inner lives, and often these are conflicting messages. For instance, maybe you've heard the message that it's permissible and acceptable for women to be sad, but it's not permissible or acceptable for women to be angry. I know I've heard that message before. And on the other hand, maybe you've heard the message that it's permissible and acceptable for men to be angry, but it is not permissible or acceptable for men to be sad. It's difficult. It's difficult to be transformed by Christ when we've been formed by our culture. But we haven't just been formed by the world, by our culture. We are also formed by our families of origin. Now, most of our families communicated explicitly or implicitly which emotions were okay to express. Some were okay, and some were not, and we should keep those to ourselves. And we've also been formed by church culture. Many of us have been shaped by what can only be called bad theology, the religious teaching that taught that depression was the result of sin, that anxiety meant you weren't trusting in God, that anger equals hate. Now, our inner lives have been formed by the world, by our families of origins, and by the church. Spiritual health and emotional health are not only incredibly important, they're also connected to one another. Last year, we read Pete Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And in fact, if you were here for the first time, we'd love to give you a free copy of that book. After you fill out your connection card and drop it in the bucket, pick up a book. Now, Scazzero founded the church that Velotis now leads, and he said this in Emotionally Healthy Spirituality: it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. If we don't know how to navigate our inner worlds, it's an indication of spiritual immaturity. Now, one of the things we do here is we have chat questions. So turn to one another, put it in the chat. If you engage with emotionally healthy spirituality, how would you summarize it? And if you didn't, what intrigues you about it? Part of having emotionally healthy spirituality involves working through these things together in community. And today we're going to do that by looking toward the Psalms. Now, the Psalms is a collection of poems and songs compiled as a book and included in the Old Testament, which is the first part of our Bible. These poems and songs were written by many different people. Many of them are attributed to David, but they were written by lots of different people. Like much poetry, the Psalms are emotional. In some cases, they're raw. In some cases, they're hopeful. Like, they really run the gamut. The book has functioned like a prayer book or a song book for a long time. Now, Psalms gives us a picture of what it means to hold on to every part of our lives without shying away from the less comfortable, less shiny parts of us. We see it all through the Psalms. It becomes like a prayer book, like I said, for the people of God. Now, the Psalms remind us that God gives us permission to be human. We don't have to be suspicious of our humanity. For instance, in Psalm 22, David writes this: my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. God doesn't censor the writers of the Psalms. God doesn't delete or edit what the psalmist wrote. I mean, can you imagine? Like, it would have been pretty easy. They didn't have photocopier machines when the manuscripts were written. The manuscripts were handwritten and hand copied. It would have been pretty easy for God to prompt the scribes to just, oops, delete some of the more problematic, raw parts of these prayers. But God doesn't do that. Now, here's an important thing for all of us to remember that you might not have heard before. Just because David said it doesn't necessarily mean that God approves it. Just because it's recorded by the Bible doesn't mean that it's recommended by the Bible. There's a big difference between things that are descriptive, they describe what happened, and things that are prescriptive, that prescribe to us what we should do. And Jesus helps us to discern the difference there. Jesus is the interpretive lens for the rest of the Bible. Jesus helps us know what is simply recorded and what is recommended in the Bible. Now, in Psalm 22 specifically, David begins the psalm expressing sadness, anger, and fear, these difficult emotions. Notice I didn't say they're negative emotions. Emotions aren't negative or positive. Sometimes they're comfortable or uncomfortable, easy to feel and process or difficult to feel and process, but they're not negative and positive. They just are. They're an expression of our humanity. So we're going to take some time to look at each of those emotions through this psalm and how our culture, our families of origin, and the church have malformed us in our expressions of these emotions. And then we'll present a new way, a way that can let us be transformed by Christ. And we're going to start with grief. The psalmist says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. It's like he's saying, God, why have you not intervened? Where are you? David is expressing grief. This is an intense expression of sorrow. And this can be a difficult thing to express. For some of us, it's difficult to express because it's a personality issue. Nathan and I joke about whether it's optimism or denial on one hand, realism or pessimism on the other hand, and I'll let you guess which one of us is on which side of that divide. I've also known people who have been quick to tell me how positivity is one of their top strengths. And I think if positivity is one of your top strengths and you lean toward optimism and looking at the silver lining on things, it can be incredibly difficult to express genuine sadness. The temptation will be to rush through or past the grief altogether to find that silver lining. And for some of us, sadness is difficult because in our families, we weren't given the chance to be sad as children. We were told to stop crying before we verbalized a desire. Maybe you were learning to ride a bike and you fell and you started crying and your parent rushed over and said, "You're okay." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, almost a demand. You are okay. You will be okay. Did you know that when you hand a crying person a tissue, it's actually a subconscious request for them to stop crying? Like that's the message it sends to them. Most of us are not aware of that, but most of us are also so uncomfortable with our sadness and grief that we rush people through theirs. For some of us, it's difficult to express sadness because of the bad theology that shaped us. We've been told that sadness is a sign of poor faith, that sadness means we don't have faith that things will get better or that heaven is good or that God cares. Sadness means we lack belief. And those experiences have shaped us. We carry them into adulthood with us. And if we don't examine them, if we're mindlessly formed by them, we won't know how to properly express emotions like sadness and grief. And so then when we lose things, and we will, things like jobs, relationships, family members, etc., we end up lying. We refuse to be honest with ourselves or others about the grief that we're experiencing. And so what do we do with that? How can we be deeply formed by Christ in our grief if we're not suppressing it or bypassing it? Do we just let the grief overtake us? Well, there are two questions and a practice that I want to offer you. First, what is the issue beneath my sadness? This question will help you explore deeper. Is there fear behind the sadness? Not just a grief about a loss, but fear that nothing will ever change. And then second, what might God be saying in my sadness? I'm not going to tell you that there's always a correction or a lesson in our sadness. Sometimes God might be offering validation and letting you know that God is sad with you, which can be incredibly healing. Sometimes it might be a correction. Don't you know that I'm with you? But whatever God is saying, it's worth listening. And finally, pray your sadness. You might talk to God about your sadness, but you might also just be crying with God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, that line could really be sadness or anger. It could be, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or it could be, my God, why have you forsaken me? I'm curious, what did you learn about anger in your home? Were you allowed to be angry? Were you allowed to be big angry or just little angry? Maybe you came home from school one day bothered by something that happened there. You slammed your door and threw yourself on your bed in frustration, and next thing you know, who do you think you are slamming my door? You better fix that attitude before you talk to me like that. It wasn't like, what's going on, honey? You seem like you're upset about something. And then what did you learn about anger from the church? So often there's a sort of spiritual bypassing that happens around anger in the church. Verses like these in Ephesians are used, like, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Or, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Now, these seem to be in opposition to the cry of David in Psalm 22, don't they? And these appear to be more prescriptive, don't they? They seem to tell us what to do. So how do we make sense of them? I think we have to use both hands. And on one hand, we hold on to the reality of Psalm 22. We hold on to God's invitation to us that we be fully human, experiencing anger. We see that this verse tells us to be angry. In your angry, when you're angry, don't sin. And then on the other hand, we don't want to be driven by our anger into sin. Remember, lots of our anger is related to something else. Underneath the anger is shame, insecurity, pride, grief. Instead of allowing your anger to drive you, you face it and interrogate it. Be angry, but do not sin. Be angry, but in your anger, don't sin. Now, for some of us, your anger and your ability to be honest about what's happening in you, honest that you're not just a little frustrated, but like downright angry, is something you need to grow in your ability to experience. That's your invitation today. And for others, well, being angry might just be your spiritual gift. You have no problem being big angry, and your invitation might be to interrogate your anger a little closer. Grow in not letting anger be a driving force in your life. And for both of us, the questions are the same. What's the issue beneath my anger? Very frequently, shame, insecurity, pride, and grief are behind the anger. So sit with your anger long enough that it can tell you what it is and what it's about. What might God be saying in my anger? And then listen. Sometimes my anger is me projecting my insecurity onto others, and God is inviting me to rest in God's presence. Sometimes God might be angry at the same things I am, and God might be letting me know that God feels the same way. So let God speak to you and pray my anger. All right, so I'm the kind of person who would rather say I'm frustrated than angry because it feels safer and more manageable. Like if I'm having a role renegotiation conversation with someone, it's way more likely that I'll chicken out and not say what I need to rather than lose my temper. But with God, I can let it all out. I can tell God how angry I am. I can cry and I can lose it. I can yell. God can handle all of my big anger, and I'm so thankful for that. And now it's time for our second chat question. What did you learn about anger from culture or in your family of origin? Like, who's allowed to express it? Does anger hurt people when it comes out? How should it be managed? Take a moment to talk about it. So we've talked about sadness and anger so far, but I don't want us to miss fear. About halfway through the poem, David says this: "Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me." David is clearly afraid. He's terrified. And he doesn't appear to be self-conscious about giving voice to the anxiety that he's experiencing. But this is difficult for us to express in so many places. Fear in our culture is sometimes equated with a vulnerability, like it's a weakness that can be exploited. And so we often think, oh, it's just better to hide it. In some of our families, fear was something to be ignored or conquered at any cost. Like, you'll be fine. Stop worrying about it. And so we went inward with our fear. We just stuffed it down. And then there are the messages we got about fear from the church. Maybe you've experienced a serious diagnosis, or you've had a close family member receive a serious diagnosis, and you felt as if it would be wrong for you to be afraid or nervous about the future, because fear would mean that you don't have faith in God as healer, as provider, as protector. And if you don't have faith, then God won't be pleased with you. Maybe you've heard that you can't have faith and fear at the same time, like they can't coexist. And let me tell you, this is destructive. And it's complicated. Just like with anger, the Bible seems to have some contradictory things to say about fear. The words "do not fear" appear in the Bible numerous times. I've heard somewhere that they appear in the Bible 365 times, like enough for one every day, but I haven't taken the time to confirm that. But the thing is, I don't think that God is trying to get us to bypass our fear or not feel fear. I think God is encouraging us to fix our eyes on God in the midst of the fear, to remember that God is with us, and to ask ourselves, what is beneath my fear? What might God be saying in my fear? And then to take that time to pray my fear. And all of this sounds almost manageable, right? When we're on our own, like, okay, I can go into my little corner or pull out my journal. I can work through this on my own. My emotions feel almost under control when I'm by myself. But eventually, I'm going to need to leave my prayer closet or put my journal down and interact with other human beings. A key part of being deeply formed in our emotional health is helping to build an emotionally healthy community. So how do we do that? Well, we begin by growing and discerning the deeper messages behind our emotions. Have you ever had an email hit your inbox? You don't even know what it's about, but the sender and the vague subject line have your stomach sinking. You opt not to look at it right then, but it just lingers in the back of your head, distracting you so that you're dreading it when you finally have to open it up and process it. Interrupt that process. Ask yourself about the story that's shaping up in your head. The more honest you can be with yourself in that moment, the more prepared you can be to respond to the message rather than reacting and leaking that anxiety out all over the people who are closest to you. And second, we grow in hearing from God what God is saying in our emotions. That process of listening to God is really difficult, especially when our emotions are charged. Sometimes, not always, this is helped in community. Sometimes it's our community who speaks to us the truth of God. But sometimes this happens when you're on your own in a way that then can bless the community. I remember praying after I found out that I was expecting Anya, my youngest daughter. We had had 2 miscarriages in the years between when I had Liam and then when I found out Anya was on her way. And I was scared. I told God about my fear, and God responded with reassurance. I am with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. My goodness and mercy will follow you. And I told God that it hadn't felt like that. It hadn't felt like goodness and mercy over the past few years, and I needed help understanding that. And God said, I am your goodness and mercy, which for me at the time was incredibly healing. And I think it's been helpful for other people since then as I've shared my story. It helped me make sense of my experiences. And this point about hearing from God is so closely tied to the third step of building emotionally healthy community. And that is that we grow in praying our feelings. We practice, validate, and encourage folks to cry out to God in sadness, anger, and fear. Maybe we even give voice to those emotions on someone else's behalf. We cry out with someone who has just received news of a diagnosis. God, we are confused. We're angry about this diagnosis. We wanted more time. It's not fair. Or we pray together in the wake of tragedy. God, we're angry. How long, O Lord, will you forget us? My God, have you forgotten us? Have you forsaken us? We pray our feelings in community. And finally, we grow in our capacity to be present with others and their emotions. And this is like the main point that we're working toward. This emotional health isn't just so that I can pat myself on the back for my emotional growth. It's not so that I can give myself a high five for all my hard work. The thing is, when you've tasted your own grief and sadness, the expiration dates that we put on other people's grief disappear. If you haven't been through something like that before, you tend to expect all right, time's up. It's been 3 months. Let's just get over it. But once you've been through your own loss and you've processed it, you tend to hold space for other people's grief, however long it takes to find healing on the other side. And this brings us to our final chat question. Have you ever had someone be present with you and your feelings? What was that experience like for you? Take a moment and talk about it. So what we learn in Psalm 22 is that David holds all of these emotions together. But this isn't actually just about David. The verse is also on the lips of someone else. It's the prayer that Jesus prays on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is fully God and Jesus is fully human. And in his full divinity, Jesus reveals to us who God is. In his full humanity, Jesus reveals to us ourselves. He's a man of sorrows, familiar with our grief. Jesus demonstrates anger. Jesus experiences fear in the Garden of Gethsemane. And at the end of that night, he surrenders to God. Not my will, but yours be done. But the story of Jesus and the story of Christianity, they don't end with, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's not the end of the story. Thank God. The thing about how Jesus quotes the Old Testament is that he uses a short phrase to refer to the whole chapter. So when he quotes something like Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's invoking the whole poem. And this Psalm 22, and our story ends with joy and rejoicing. The wild and unexpected part about emotional health is that joy is connected to sadness and anger and fear. If you cut off part of who you are, it compromises your ability to feel joy. If you cut off grief from your life, it compromises your ability to feel joy. If you cut off anger from your life, it compromises your ability to feel joy. If you cut off fear from your life, it compromises your ability to feel joy. And this is what Jesus was thinking on the cross. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. The salvation story doesn't end with forsakenness. It ends with, he has done it. Jesus says it's finished. He's done it. This is not a stretch to invoke here, not even a little bit. He has rescued us. He has provided for us. He's saved us. He's forgiven us. He's poured out mercy on us. We have to see the trajectory of Jesus' life and words here. Jesus holds in his body grief, sadness, anxiety, and anger, but the story, it ends with joy. And that's my hope for you. God longs for you to live with deep, abiding joy. The path to joy isn't a shortcut past difficult emotions. The path to joy doesn't bypass those hard things. Often, the way to joy goes through grief, anger, and fear. And the question that you're invited to wrestle with is this: are you living a fully human life, or have you cut off parts of yourself? To follow Jesus is to become a whole person, to accept and integrate all of your emotions. Just like Riley had to accept her grief in order to feel joy again, we need to accept and experience all of our emotions in order to feel joy.